Syndrome. A special hello goes out to Director of Media for the Boston Rollins alumni, Mr. Mark Willand. Nice to see you, Marky.
Welcome to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast, the voice of hockey legends. This is the classic hockey show for classic hockey fans. We celebrate the history of the game with stories told by the select few who actually lived it. Get ready for an all-access pass to the heart of the hockey universe. This is episode 47 of the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Willand. We'll play 3 periods in this episode. First, we'll start with our Classic Stories series. Tonight is part 1 of Hockey Fights. 3 of our guests from previous shows, Jerry Rollins, Joe Noris, and John Van Boxmeer, share their old-time hockey fight tales. In period 2, we'll get caught up with classic hockey news, and we'll remember the man who took down the Eagle, journalist Russ Conway, who passed away this past week. And in period 3, we'll have an informative interview with Vince Cimini, the executive director of the Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame, which celebrates its new class of inductees on September 9, 2019 at Twin River in Lincoln, Rhode Island. In this interview, you'll learn all about this year's class, which includes Brian Boucher and Brian Burke. And Vince also reminds us about how Rhode Island helped shape the game of hockey as we know it today. Mrs. PHA and I will be at the event, and we hope you can join us as well. Although it's the so-called off-season, the response from you, the fans, has been incredible as our audience has seen exponential growth this summer. We thank you for your support and remind you, if you haven't already, to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes. This helps the show become more visible to hockey fans around the world. We've got some sensational shows coming up in the next few weeks, and we're looking forward to another season of stories from the legends who made the game great. Now, let's talk classic hockey. This week in classic hockey news, we note the passing of journalist Russ Conway. He passed away last week at the age of 70. He was a writer for the Lawrence Eagle Tribune in Massachusetts. Of course, he covered the Boston Bruins, and he did so starting in the late 60s and early 70s. And what he's best known for is taking down Alan Eagleson and exposing the corruption at the highest levels in the National Hockey League. Looking at the Eagle Tribune story about Russ's passing, it notes that his relationship with Bobby Orr was very instrumental in his investigations into players not receiving proper benefits, especially former players who seemed to be getting the short end of an arrangement with the Players Association, which was headed by Alan Eagleson, who also was the agent for players, friends with owners, friends with management, and the conflicts of interest are the type of things that Russ Conway exposed in his book, Game Misconduct. Now, it's interesting that here he is writing for a relatively small paper in Massachusetts. All these misdeeds were happening under the noses of the big newspapers in Toronto and Montreal and Boston, but it was Russ Conway who ended up exposing it all. Looking at the story again, it notes that one of the most powerful and well-recognized people in the sport, Alan Eagleson, was brought down and charged by U.S. Canadian authorities as a result of Conway's work. Conway's subsequent book, Game Misconduct, Alan Eagleson and the Corruption of Hockey, revealed that Eagleson had deceived Orr into leaving the Bruins or the Chicago Blackhawks at the end of his career. And of course, Orr did not want to leave the Boston Bruins. The Bruins desperately wanted to keep him and offered him 18.5% of the ownership stake in the franchise to keep him. Eagleson never told Orr of this. That would be worth about $150 million today. Instead, he did a backdoor deal with the Chicago Blackhawks and his good friend Bill Wirtz and his client Bob Pulford, and Orr ended up limping through a few seasons in Chicago. or, of course, at the end of his career when it was all over, the greatest player to ever play in 1980. By the time he got done paying back taxes and other type of things in his dealings with Eagleson, was essentially broke at the end of his career. Our friend Rick Middleton noted that the thing about Russ is that he looked out for the little guys that were long retired and struggling. He cared about people. We respected him as players, but after I retired, he became a true friend. I love the guy. And that comes from Rick Middleton and hearing about Russ's passing. I wanted to also note a story about Jim Harrison. When you really read the book Game Misconduct, and you can still get it on Amazon or anywhere. I've read the book a couple times over the years, and looking at a website, Amateur Sport, and it talks about the Jim Harrison case, and it's worth noting here. And I'll quote from the blog post. The Jim Harrison case is revealing. Harrison's back was shot. He could scarcely walk, much less play. The Blackhawks jerked him around. He filed a grievance through Eagleson, head of the NHLPA, and Harrison's agent. But Eagleson was also the agent for Chicago coach and general manager and longtime pal Bob Pulford. And Pulford was employed by Eagleson's yachting companion and Florida neighbor, Blackhawk owner Bill Wirtz. The grievance, as per the collective agreement negotiated by Eagleson, was heard by another pal, NHL president John Ziegler, whose salary was paid by Wirtz and the other owners. The deck was stacked. Eagleson cut a private deal with Pulford to the benefit of the Blackhawks and the detriment of his client. So much for Jim Harrison. Harrison, of course, really struggled at the end of his career and into retirement with chronic pain issues, and was absolutely, for lack of a better term, screwed over by his own agent, Eagleson. It's also worth noting here in the story, too, and I'll continue. In another instance, Eagleson convinced injured Boston Bruins player Mike Gillis to pay him 15% of whatever was received from Gillis's disability insurance. Securing the claim, Eagleson noted, would be tough. Yet Conway revealed that the meeting at which this deal was struck occurred after Eagleson had already been notified by the insurer that Gillis's claim had been approved. Eagleson was paid $41,250 for that scam. So in the end, Russ Conway did a lot of great things as a journalist locally here in Massachusetts, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer for his work on the Eagleson situation. And that's how he'll be remembered, as noted by Rick Middleton, as a friend of the retired player who had their backs and really changed the game forever by exposing the corruption that occurred as a result of Alan Eagleson, who, of course, later was jailed for his misdeeds. Now it's time for our Hockey Fight Stories Part 1. The three players, as I noted, will tell their hockey fight tales. First, we begin with Jerry Rollins, who at the age of 17 had a 10-game junior tryout, decided to take on a player from the other team who he did not know, did pretty well in the fight, and learned later that ignorance is bliss because the player he took on was probably the most feared puncher of that generation. Our second story from Joe Noris, who played with the Pittsburgh Penguins and was teammates with Brian Bugsy Watson, and he tells of his very first NHL game and kind of a crazy story about Bugsy, even for his standards. And finally, John Van Boxmeer, 1973-74. He ended up on the wrong end of a sucker punch from Dave Schultz in a nationally televised game, and he has somewhat of a philosophical look back at that very brief encounter with the ultimate Broad Street bully.
So I was on a 10-game tryout. I remember the team picked me up in the Vancouver area. They just played New Westminster. And we went to Victoria. I practiced with the team in Victoria for 2 days and then drove the bus across the country, get to know the guys. We went to this place called Regina, which I'd never been to Regina, Saskatchewan in my life. And I was on a 10-game tryout. And in the first period, if memory doesn't serve me correctly, I was behind the net with the puck, and a guy came and just tried to knock me down, and I knocked him on his butt. And he got up and dropped his gloves, and we had a fight, and I did really good. And we were on the way to the penalty box, and he came after me again, and we had a fight, and I did really good. And we got kicked out of the game. Dennis Sobchak, who was on Regina, and Ron Andrus, who later played in Montreal and other teams.
Right.
They got in a fight as well. And I remember being in the dressing room when the team came in the dressing room, and Patty Gunnell, the coach, walked in the dressing room, and the players kind of looking at me strangely. And Patty walked in the dressing room and said, "Kid, you just made the team." And the guy's name was Clark Gillies.
That's
and that I fought.
Oh, my goodness gracious!
Thank God I didn't know who he was and how tough he was.
Oh boy! I mean,
I probably would have turned tail and ran.
Oh, absolutely. Probably, if you look at the history of fighting in the NHL, there's probably nobody more feared. You didn't want to get him upset. Yeah, even Dave.
He is one tough. I mean, talk about one amazing hockey player, amazing human being, and just in my book, one of the, I have guys like Howe and Ferguson, and him up there is the toughest guys ever.
Oh, absolutely.
And but Clark was an honest guy, and he just didn't know why this 17-year-old kid knocked him down, right? It was just a normal reaction, but thankfully, he probably took pity on me and didn't beat me to within an inch of my life.
My very first game, we played against the Philadelphia Flyers in Pittsburgh as the home opener. I forget which period it was, but a rookie for the Flyers named Pierre Plante scored a goal, and I happened to be sitting on the bench next to Brian Watson, who was just a notorious tough guy and just an instigator and everything you could ever talk about. So we're sitting on the bench, and Pierre Plante scores a goal. Bugsy looks at me and he says, "There is no effing way a rookie is going to score a goal in his first game against my team in my building and get away with it." At that time, everybody was going back to center ice for the face-off. The referee was getting the puck to give to Pierre. Bugsy jumps over the boards, skates full speed into the face-off circle, cross-checks Pierre Plante in the face. Both benches empty, and there's a massive brawl going on. That's the first game. Pierre was out for the first half of the year because of that. He broke his jaw, and,
Really?
that was it. So,
didn't know that.
Boxmeer with one punch, and Boxmeer is down. Schultz got his glove off and topped Van Boxmeer with one punch, and he went back like a tree falling down, and the crowd booing Schultz. There was a penalty coming up to Montreal, a delayed penalty, and I'm not sure who that was going to be on, Ted. I think it may have been on Van Boxmeer, and Schultz's shot there may have been retaliation for whatever Van Boxmeer is going to be penalized for, which I think is a high stick.
It looks, and of course, maybe it was too Schultz, and this is what caused that punch. And believe me, you've heard of the shortest fights in history, but whether Van Boxmeer wasn't ready for it, but you should always be ready for the unexpected, and particularly when you're playing against a fellow like Dave Schultz, who is known as...
Wow. I don't think it affected me that much. The problem was it was my own fault in my own way, because I had been playing in Halifax. That was only like my third game up. And, we had been taking boxing lessons with Al McNeil, just getting some confidence. And the Flyers had been just kind of coming into their own, and the Broad Street Bullies were taking hold, and the game was changing a little bit, and Montreal really didn't have a lot of toughness at the time. And I thought, well, hey, if I, get to fight here and do good, like I could probably, make myself a home for myself on the team.
Mm-hmm.
So I had kind of, the play had come down, and I had given Billy Barber a shot. And there was a delayed penalty on me. Well, then Barber ended up going off when Schultz came on the ice. And so he came to the front of the net, and, I kind of gave him a shot, and I figured he was going to push me back, and we drop our gloves and go. Well, he ended up dropping one glove, and he drilled me, and that was the end of the story, And I remember I'm on my ass, and Neil Armstrong was the linesman. He goes, "Stay down, Jeff." I looked at him, I said, "Hey, Neil, where do you want me to go? Where do you think I'm going to go?" So, then I kind of realized then that maybe being a fighter wasn't my calling card.
Well, you picked the number one guy, the 472 penalty minute guy to get started with. So I give you credit for that, for jumping right into the deep end of the pool.
Yeah, well, it wasn't my best decision in my career, let's put it that way.
Vince Cimini and the folks at the Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame have done an incredible job at capturing the rich history and tradition of Rhode Island hockey. And in this discussion, we talk about the Hall of Fame and, again, the role that Rhode Island played in shaping the game of hockey. We're back on the show with Vince Cimini, who's the chairman of the Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame, and it's great to have Vince on here. He is a person who has, for a long while now, been a centerpiece of Rhode Island hockey history. Recently saw Vince at the Rhode Island Reds Heritage Society event, and that was a tremendous event as well. I had a chance to sit with Rick Middleton and Don McKenney, and Vince did a nice presentation as well. So we're glad to have him on the show today. Vince, thanks for being with us.
Nice to be with you, Mark. Nice to be with you.
Vince, we've got the Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame event coming up September 6th at Twin River in Lincoln, Rhode Island, and as I said in our Rhode Island Reds Heritage show, and talking with Buster Clegg, I was incredibly impressed with what you were able to pull together last year. It was a first-class event. Now, I didn't attend. This year I will be attending. But from all the pictures, video, and then word of mouth that I talked to some people who've been there, said it was first class all the way. So the first question, Vince, is what was the inspiration behind this? How did that whole process start? Because it's not an easy undertaking, but certainly was worthwhile. You got out to a great start. How did that all come together?
Well, it was kind of a confluence of events. The Reds Heritage Society has a website, and one of the things that it was missing was a recap of the Reds Hall of Fame. The Reds actually, with Buster Clegg's initiative and Lou Perry's initiative back in the early 60s, decided to chronicle the great players who had played for the Reds. And back in those days, of course, players didn't just suit up for a couple of years or a year and then go to an NHL team. Back in the day, there were the original six, and there was an original 6 or 7 or 8 at the most on the American Hockey League level, and some of those players played for years, 10, 12, 13 years, even more in some cases. And so we embarked on the challenge of putting together a database and chronicling the histories of all of these great players who ended up in the Reds Hall of Fame over a 10-year period of time, 1963 through 1973. Mm-hmm. The Reds, of course, moved to the Dunkin' Donuts Center in the early 70s, and the practice of Hall of Fame inductions ended. In addition to that, there are more actually former Reds who were inductees in Hall of Fames and other Halls of Fame, like the Hall of Fame in Toronto, for example, and in their own state or in their own province and so forth. Mm-hmm. So we were engaged by USA Hockey, Rhode Island Hockey, the local arm of USA Hockey here in Rhode Island, to talk about something that they had in mind as well. And we sat together, representatives of the Heritage Society and Rhode Island Hockey, and decided that we were going to undertake the creation of a Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame. And while we we thought that, I mean, with us, with the Heritage Society, we'd always thought that hockey began and ended with the Reds. I mean, it was when the auditorium opened in 1926, the Reds were formed, and it was the first indoor rink in the state of Rhode Island, and hockey blossomed. But in fact, we had been playing hockey here 30 years before the auditorium had been built, all outdoor hockey, and we decided to undertake this. So I, silly me, raised my hand and said, I'll take the lead on it. And within a couple of weeks, we had written databases on at least 40 or 45 players of renown over the history of the game. And as we were doing it, we learned some things that were literally jaw-dropping about our history. And we started this in September of 3 years ago, and we decided that we were going to do this right. If we were going to do it at all, we were going to do it right. We weren't going to do it in some back hall at a restaurant. We were going to do it in a big venue,
right.
which we did have it in, and we embarked on this challenge. And 2 years later, we had our event at the Twin River Casino and Event Center here in Lincoln, where we'll have it again on September 6th this year. We have, over the last 3 years, put together profiles on over 200 Rhode Islanders who played professional hockey, who played in represented the nation in U.S. Worlds competition and in the Olympics. We're all Americans. We haven't chronicled the literally hundreds of players that have come out of Rhode Island and are into college education and some of the great schools in this country, and overseas as well. Maybe someday we'll get to that, but there's still a lot of research work that goes on. So that's how it started. And as you mentioned, we had our inaugural class that the Providence Journal dubbed the Mount Rushmore of Rhode Island hockey. Back in September last year. We had over 400 people attend the event, and it was easily the greatest gathering of Rhode Island hockey royalty, so to speak, that we've ever seen. Some of the great names in Rhode Island and in hockey in general, the Armies. I mean, you could list all the characters in the alphabet, and there would be a family here in Rhode Island that would represent, from the Armies or the Belisles or the Bennetts or the Kavanaughs all the way up to the Agneseks and Zivkaks in Burrillville, which is one of the great, New England hockey stories, this little sleepy town in northern Rhode Island.
Yeah, sure is.
So, so that's where it started, and we have a great board of directors, some of whom are well known to the general hockey community around the country, especially in New England. Mel Goldenberg, who's been with the Heritage Society for many years, has been a great help. Bob Lawrence, who was a former president of Rhode Island Hockey. Richard Oliver, a former president of Rhode Island Hockey. Ray Morgan, who was who ran clinics up in Lake Placid for USA Hockey, women's hockey, and so forth. Joe McDonald, who is the beat writer for The Athletic for the Bruins. Mark Diver, who covered hockey for 30 years at the Providence Journal. Am I missing anybody here? Who am I missing? Billy O'Connor, who's run the reunions for the Reds, the annual reunion for the last 19 years. So quite a board of directors we're proud of. I should also mention that when we started this effort, Buster Clegg and Arnie Bailey, who were the linchpins of the Rhode Island Reds Heritage Society, Buster, of course, the founder of it, were part of the board. They have now retired, so to speak, from the board, replaced by very capable people. And we made a conscious decision up front that with all of the nominees and all of the candidates for the Hall of Fame, that we as a board would cleanse our hands of the selection process. We call it the Pontius Pilate effect. And we decided that we would put that in the hands of selection committee that would be as impartial as possible. In other words, not connected to any high school or college, or have a strong affiliation that would in any way, bend the voting, so to speak. And we decided also that they didn't necessarily have to be strictly hockey people. They had to be people who were sports historians in many ways. And Ed Acorn, for example, who is the editorial vice president of the Providence Journal, is on that selection committee and has been the last 2 years. And Ed is one of the great baseball historians in the United States. He's written several books on the history of baseball, and if you ever have a chance to read them, you won't get 4 pages into the book and you'll find yourself in another century. They're just absolutely incredible. So there's a great sense of history and what the impact of these athletes have and had on the game of hockey. We have journalists like John Galuli, who was the schoolboy journalist for over 30 years at the Journal. Frank Capano, the longtime television personality, sports director at WJAR Channel 10 here in Providence. Ken Bell at Channel 6. This year, Greg Boris, who is a former publicity from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and a former publicity director and communications director for the New York Islanders and the Florida Panthers, and for 19 years, Major League Baseball's communications director. And just an incredible talent. And if you know anything about Greg, he pretty much introduced social media to the professional game, both in hockey and in baseball. So he's been a great asset as well, and on other fronts. So that process was put in the hands of people who would be as impartial as possible and look at the total scope of somebody's impact on the game and what they meant to the game. Those are the roots of it. And like I said, we had 16 great names that were inducted in the inaugural class last year. They included, if I can recall them all now, Lou Lamoriello, who I'm sure your audience knows very well. Cami Granato, considered by many the greatest women's hockey player of all time, not only in the United States but throughout the world. Chris Terreri, Zelio Topazzini, who's an American Hockey League Hall of Famer and the player of the century here for the Rhode Island Reds. Ron Wilson, All-American, All-Stater, coached the NHL 648 wins, the most ever by an American coach. Brian Barad, Rookie of the Year in 1997 in the NHL. Brian Lawton, the first American-born player to be selected first in the NHL entry draft. Lou Perry, one of the great sports entrepreneurs and promoters of the 20th century, who was the owner of the Reds and longtime owner of the Providence Rhode Island Auditorium. Dick Rondo, who is the first Rhode Islander to be elected into the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame, and at one time held 8 collegiate scoring records, still holds several of them right now. Matt Schneider, of course, out of Mount St. Charles, the great high school program here in Rhode Island, a 21-year NHL career, 2-time All-Star and Stanley Cup winner. Keith Carney, an All-American at Maine, played a number of times for representing the country in the Olympics. Joe Cavanaugh, one of the great, maybe in some people's mind, the greatest Rhode Island schoolboy player. He was a 3-time All-American at Harvard. Broke his wrist in Olympic training camp and went on to become one of the most highly regarded attorneys in this state and in this region. Sarah DaCosta, who was the first female goaltender in Division I in Rhode Island, and went on to along with Cami Granato and 7 other Rhode Island college players, win the 1998 gold medal, the first women's gold medal in Nagano. And of course, Bill Belisle, the legendary Mount St. Charles coach, who is also inducted in the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame. He recorded over 1,000 victories, and his team, Mount St. Charles team, won a national record 26 consecutive Rhode Island state titles. That's not to diminish Rhode Island hockey. Let me see here. The Bennetts, Harvey Bennett Sr., Reds, famous Reds goaltender, AHL Hockey Hall of Famer, and Kurt Bennett, who was a Brown All-American and the first Rhode Island developed player to skate in the National Hockey League and the first American developed player to score 30 goals in an NHL season. I guess that's it. for this first year. Yeah.
Quite an auspicious start. Kurt Bennett would have come all the way from Hawaii to join you last year, which says a lot. And so you had the great first event. What's the process like for the people you've chosen, your selection committee? What type of process do they go through to chisel down to each year's class?
Yeah, well, that's the one main thing that the board of directors does, in addition to building the databases on all of these players and building on their stories, because every year, almost every week, every month, we find new things about these individuals that we add to their database, and that's the pros profile. We get together over a period of time and review all of the nomination, all of the candidate profiles, and we narrowed down. This past year, we narrowed down to slightly over 30 candidates that we thought were the most worthy of induction at this particular time, and that is a difficult process, and it's made more difficult because we are new. Our history goes back 121 years. That's a long time. Organized hockey, it's a longer history than Minnesota, for example, as long as Massachusetts, because we started our organized hockey history, Brown versus Harvard in 1898, and we actually go further back in Rhode Island with Malcolm Chase, who's going to be inducted this year, with the arrival of hockey, organized hockey in the United States. So we put together this group of people, and the pool is very large. And so it's a difficult process. And then we gather all that information, and we pass it on to... Now, nominations also come in from the public. We will ask the public to make their nominations October and November of this year. In December, the nominations will go to, the final nominations will be selected, and they'll be pooled along with the board's nominations, and they will go to the selection committee. And then the selection committee will have 2 weeks to diligently go through all of the nominations and vote. There's a certain voting process that we have, a point system, and it's going to take quite a while for us to exhaust the pool, and hopefully more will be added.
Oh, absolutely.
It will keep getting the Charis of the world. Exactly.
Oh, absolutely. With the state of amateur hockey in Rhode Island, that will keep being replenished among young players, and as you said, people you may not have considered somewhat in the recent history, their careers may have gone a different direction and made them, more desirous for induction as well. So you never really know. And, this year, no letdown in year two. You come away with some great inductees. That whole process works well for you again. And there are a few that I want to talk about and that our fans are familiar with. And the first one is Brian Boucher, who is just an outstanding television presence for NBC. And he really is, he seems like such a natural on there, but obviously had a lengthy NHL career as well. Can you talk a little bit about him and his career as a schoolboy in Rhode Island and his induction?
Sure. Well, he was part of that long reign of Mount St. Charles dominance in Rhode Island back in his day in the late 80s and early 90s. He moved on after his junior year to the Western Hockey League, where he became an all-star there. He was drafted in 1995 by the Philadelphia Flyers. in the first round, he went on to some great renown, considering all of the goaltenders that have played in the National Hockey League. Brian's greatest achievement, I suppose, inarguably, was he set the all-time record in Phoenix with the Coyotes with 5 consecutive shutouts. Imagine that today.
Incredible.
5 consecutive shutouts and over 330 consecutive minutes of shutout play. A remarkable goaltender. He is the all-time leading goals against average of any Rhode Island goaltender, and we've had dozens of them out of this state. Brian, as you mentioned, is a rising star on the NHL Network. He's the behind-the-glass person, analyst. He's very incisive, incredibly articulate, and has a wonderful demeanor with the players and the coaches that he interviews. He also does studio work for the NHL Network, and I think still does analysis on the Philadelphia Flyers network as well. As you mentioned, a great personality, very appealing, and he attended last year's induction ceremonies. And,
oh, good.
Of course, he'll be there on stage this year to receive his due and his tribute.
Another strong personality in here that our fans are very familiar with is Brian Burke. And so we're very looking forward to his induction speech, and talk a little bit about Brian and his induction.
Well, Brian was born in Providence, a large family, I think 9 brothers and sisters. They eventually moved to Edina, Minnesota, where he developed his hockey skills. But he returned to Rhode Island to play for Lou Lamoriello. He played 4 years at Providence College. He started a connection there with Ron Wilson that went on through their professional careers. He co-captained Providence College along with Ron for Lou Lamoriello. And then he went on to play pro hockey for Springfield, and won a Calder Cup playing for Maine in the 1980s, and then with the encouragement of Lou Lamoriello, decided to get a law degree. He's a bright guy, and he received his Juris Doctor out of Harvard, and then went into the player agent business. And then shortly after that, found himself as GM with the Vancouver Canucks, and the rest is history. He went on to GM, be general manager at 4 other franchises, if I can remember correctly. Toronto. Where are we here?
Don't forget the Hartford Whalers.
The Hartford Whalers, of course, right? And the Anaheim Mighty Ducks, and with the Ducks in 2007, he was the architect of their Stanley Cup winning team, and I think one of the great photographs that we'll see in the video presentation for Brian is hoisting that Stanley Cup, and wonderful tribute. Brian also served as a member of Rugby Canada's board of directors. He was the general manager of the United States men's ice hockey team for the 2010 Winter Olympics, along with his coach and former captain Ron Wilson. And right now, he's a color analyst on Hockey Night in Canada and Rogers Sportsnet, and he's one of the most articulate analysts I think I've ever seen. He is very incisive with his evaluation of the game and of players and of the game in general. He's, of course, been an advocate for a number of years on widening the hockey rink to a more international level based on the new speeds and the power of the game that has changed over the years. Not a small undertaking considering what would have to be done done in these arenas and so forth, but maybe laying the groundwork for the new arenas that are being built to get them a little bit bigger. I know that's tough in today's day and age when you're trying to squeeze every penny out of. You know, it's easier to make the rink smaller and add more seats than to enlarge it, because that's a difficult process, especially retrofitting an existing arena. But those are the kinds of things I think that where Brian's mind works, and it's always to improve the game and improve play and improve the state of hockey.
Absolutely.
So he's a wonderful nominee this year, a wonderful inductee this year.
He sure is. And between those two, I'm looking forward to their speeches as we sat in. There are other strong candidates as well. Jack Caprano, brother Ardlen Beaudet, Malcolm Chase, Judge James Julie, Thomas Eccleston Jr., David Emma, and, of course, Digit Murphy, former coach of Brown University, among other things, representing the women. But I want to talk about a guy that I saw at the Springfield Hockey Reunion, the Rhode Island Hockey Reunion, a great member of the Los Angeles Kings alumni, and just one of those guys that everybody likes in hockey, who had a terrific career as a trainer in the National Hockey League, International Hockey, and in the American Hockey League, and got his start in Rhode Island. Pete Demers. Talk a little bit about Pete Demers.
Well, Pete, interesting. Pete started with the Reds when I worked with the Reds back in the '60s. I was a college student who became the publicity director for the Reds while I was in college, and George Army, the great George Army, who was Pete's mentor, and also the mentor for Tom Woodcock, another Hall of Fame trainer. So back in the late '60s, George would sometimes not go on road trips, and that would be Pete's responsibility. And if I was available, I would join Pete. We'd room together and kind of double up on the chores and help as much as I could with his work, while I was also serving to write articles on these away visits and so forth. So we go way back together. Pete was a rink rat like I was. How I got my job and how Pete got his job, and Pete learned under George. Took some courses at Brown University and at URI. At the urgence of Jim Fullerton, the great Hall of Fame coach at Brown University, and a few years later found himself with the job with the Springfield Kings, the farm team of Los Angeles, and a couple of years later he was promoted to the parent club in Los Angeles, and that began a 34-year career and over 2,600 consecutive games that he tended to the wounds of players like Wayne Gretzky and Rogie Vachon, and he is one of the most wonderful and appreciative people for what hockey has given him. As you mentioned, he attends every year the reunions for the Reds and for the Springfield Indians/Kings. He was in town here a couple of weeks ago for the Reds reunion, and the week before for the Indians reunion, and he'll be back, of course, to receive his Hall of Fame medallion in Providence on September 6th. But a wonderful human being, and he's always on Facebook. He's a big fisherman, and he fishes wherever he can go, and he goes wherever he can fish. And he sends on Facebook photographs, and it seems like he never stops, either fishing or participating in some fundraiser in Los Angeles or in other cities that he's well known in. And he's a wonderful human being, an incredibly talented individual, and again, one of the proteges of the great George Army, who one day himself will be in the Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame. Right,
and as you mentioned, somebody I worked with at the beginning of my career working in the NHL, the Hartford Whalers, Tommy Woodcock. Saw a picture of Tommy, who obviously is struggling a little bit right now with his health, but saw a picture of Pete and Tommy, and it was good to see Tommy, in addition to his great work, legendary work really as a trainer in hockey with a few different franchises. Was a great guy and is a great guy. It was a great softball. He used to be our pitcher on our softball team. Excellent athlete, and I didn't realize until I didn't realize until later that he was quite a hockey player himself. Played in the Eastern League.
Oh yeah.
I always knew him in his role as a trainer. But nonetheless, I'm glad to see Pete get in. Those are the type of guys that make hockey what it is. And you can see you used the word. He's very, very appreciative. You can tell he appreciates these opportunities to meet the fans and talk hockey, being part of that family. Vince, when you did a presentation at the Reds event, you delivered some exciting news for Rhode Island hockey fans and hockey fans in general on a few fronts. I wanted to talk about those. And the first of all was the potentially having a physical presence for the Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame. Now, I know you have a visual presence in the Dunkin' Donuts Center. We'll talk about that in a second, but having a physical presence in an official home for the Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame, can you talk about that?
Well, yeah. So our mission has obviously been to showcase the achievements and the accomplishments of both players and other contributors to the game locally and globally, in fact. And one of our first missions was to build a wall of fame for our organization. And we came up with several designs that we presented to the Providence Bruins and the Dunkin' Donuts Center, which is where we believe it belongs. And some things didn't work out for one reason or another, available space and the like. The Reds, for many years, have had a presence in the Dunkin' Donuts Center in the form of 4 kiosks, 3-sided displays, which present the history of this team and the blossoming of hockey and where the passion of the game really came from in the north concourse of the Dunkin' Donuts Center. We came up with an idea that was a bit more modern with touchscreens, and so we have designed a 4-sided touchscreen wall of fame with static panels which chronicle the milestones in Rhode Island hockey history dating all the way back to 1894, and also a timeline of great events that have taken place over these past 121 years. The 2 other panels are large touchscreens, similar to what you see now in restaurants and on cruise ships and the like. It'll be a 48-inch touchscreen. It will instead of, as I mentioned to people, instead of pointing to Cheeseburger, you'll point to somebody like Lou Lamoriello and learn all about him. You'll see photographs of his tenure in the National Hockey League, maybe even his playing days at LaSalle Academy here in Providence and at Providence College. Coaching at Providence College, and also a display of the video presentation that we make for each one of the inductees. There'll also be other information as we move on the history of the game and different features that people can plug into. And there'll be 2 touch screens in this kiosk. So that's number one, and our hope is to install that at the Dunkin' Donuts Center this year. Our other end game is to build a bricks and mortar museum. We've had a number of locations reach out to us to consider their consider the placement of the Hall of Fame. Of course, this takes the raising of a lot of dollars and hard work to raise funds. We're not pulling any punches. Cancer research is more important than hockey. And we don't mean to take those dollars away, but for those who have some discretionary dollars who would like to give back to hockey in ways that hockey is given to them, we'll gladly accept any donation to eventually build this Hall of Fame. One of the locations that has been presented to us, for example, is Adelaide Arena. Adelaide Arena has been around since 1961. It's been the home of Mount St. Charles. It's named after Brother Adelaide Baudet, who's one of our inductees this year, and pretty much the founder of schoolboy hockey here, and at least in its modern form. They are planning on a new complex. Have approached us about the possibility of putting our Hall of Fame in that complex as an additional destination feature for the complex. It's all right now in the planning stages, but that is our end game, and there is so much history here. The history is really represented in the three fathers of hockey, which is really the highlight of this year's inductees. As we mentioned before, Brother Adelaide Baudet, who is the father of schoolboy hockey here in Rhode Island, arrived here in 1911 at Sacred Heart, and then in the early 1920s moved on to Mount St. Charles and began this legendary string of hockey excellence at the Mount. And then we have Judge James Dooley, who, among the many things that he did in the sports world, in addition to founding the Reds, founding the Canadian American Hockey League, which became the American Hockey League, also at one time owned the Providence Grays, which many people point to the 1880s, who won the first two World Series. And in 1928, he was an owner of the Providence Steamroller, the NHL and the NFL football team that won the 1928 NFL championship. The Steamroller is the only team to win an NFL championship that is no longer a franchise in the NFL. So, and in addition to that, he also was the secretary and responsible for the building of Narragansett Racetrack. Gansett, as it was known in its days, was one of the great racetracks in America. So he was a great entrepreneur as well. And then, of course, we have Malcolm Green Chase. And Malcolm Green Chase, probably U.S. hockey owes everything to Malcolm Green Chase. He was a world-class tennis player who's enshrined in the International Tennis Hall of Fame in Newport, Rhode Island. And as a student at Brown University, and just coming out of competition at Forest Hills for the U.S. Open, found himself at Niagara Falls at a tournament an international tournament playing against Canadian hockey players. And at that event, he learned about a game that was similar to a game that he was one of the stars of in New England, called ice polo. And ice polo seemed to him very similar to this game the Canadians were talking about called ice hockey. And the Canadians were as equally impressed and intrigued about ice polo as Malcolm was about ice hockey. And a year later, the Victoria Hockey Club of Montreal invited Malcolm to put together a team of experts in ice polo and come to Canada and for exhibitions of ice polo to the Canadians. And he put that team together with 4 players from Brown University, with a player from Columbia, from Harvard, and the gentleman from New York City who also worked with the Associated Press. And these 7 experts went to Canada. They were hailed by the Canadians as the All-Americans. That's what they called them, from city to city. And they went from Toronto to Montreal to Kingston to Ottawa, playing alternating games of ice polo and ice hockey for the locals. As word, the hard copy of the newspapers in Canada chronicled, the Americans won all of the ice polo games and the Canadians won all of the ice hockey games. But what came out of it was that Malcolm came back to the United States with hockey equipment, and all of the players went to their respective colleges with this hockey equipment and started their clubs. Brown University, Harvard, Columbia, one of the players for Brown was a postgraduate, and he went for his postgraduate studies to Cornell. The gentleman from the Associated Press, Mr. Pope, went back to New York City and spoke to the wealthy elite of New York City, and St. Nicholas Arena was built specifically for hockey. And such was the history of at least collegiate hockey in the United States, that in 1898, Brown and Harvard played the first intercollegiate league game in the history of the United States in Franklin Park in Boston, which I proudly will say Brown University won 6-0. So we owe a lot, not only in Rhode Island to Malcolm Chase, but I think the United States owes a lot to Malcolm as well. It should also be noted that Malcolm was a great businessman. The business that he founded, we know today, is Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's great company. So certainly an influential man on many, many fronts. In fact, Malcolm, at a later age in the early 1930s, during the Depression years, the Rhode Island Auditorium was foreclosed on. And if it was foreclosed on, if it went through, that would have meant the end of the Reds. They would have had no place to play because it was the only indoor rink in Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. And all of the schoolboy and all the amateur hockey that went on and collegiate hockey that went on in the state would have ceased as well. Malcolm was one of 4 people who came to the rescue. This very influential and important and concerned businessman and member of our community came to the rescue of the auditorium and saved it from foreclosure and kept it open. The second important thing that he did for Rhode Island hockey. So he's one of the inductees this year. We also have a Malcolm Green Chase award, which we started last year, that we give annually to a person whose achievement and contribution, a lifetime contribution to hockey, has been important to the game. Last year was given to Ralph Warburton, Rhode Island's first Olympic hockey hero. He played in the first post-war Olympic Games in St. Moritz in 1948 and scored 17 goals in 6 games. 17 goals. That's a career for people. And this year it goes to Larry Reed, a Rhode Islander who has been with USA Hockey and contributed to youth programs throughout the United States for the last 50 years, including being the team leader for the U.S. women's hockey teams in 1998 gold medal team, and in 2002 the first U.S. women's team to compete on home ice. So special event, a special evening again on September 6th here in Rhode Island for these incredible hockey talents and contributors.
Absolutely. Now, I want to just take one quick moment to step a little aside here. You did work for the Providence Reds in the American Hockey League, and I want to put you on the spot here. And I'm going to ask you, of the years you were working with the team and closely involved in the team, who was your favorite player that came through the Reds franchise?
Interesting. I think the most dynamic player was Bobby LeDuc. Bob eventually went on to play in the World Hockey Association, was a player coach in the World Hockey Association. He settled here in Rhode Island. He owns a very successful business in Northern Rhode Island, has been a very influential part of our community for all these years. But in those days, he was a young, strapping, strong, powerful skater and scorer. Handsome guy. His wife will attest to that, and his daughter will attest to that. And is still a very integral part of the community. Another person was Ross Brooks. Ross and I were good friends. We worked with each other in summers while I was in college at a swim and tennis club in Lincoln, Rhode Island. He's been a lifelong friend as well, and he's been a great contributor to the game of hockey in Rhode Island as a coach and longtime rink manager at Schneider Arena. Recently retired from that position and now enjoys playing golf whenever he can pick up a game. But those guys were certainly favorites of mine during those particular years.
Yeah, it was
great
a
storyline.
no, absolutely. They're very interesting individuals. I met them for the first time a few weeks ago. Bobby Leduc, of course, a lot of people. We have a lot of WHA fans in our audience, and Bobby was the player coach Toronto Toros in 74-75, and that was the year that Vaclav Nedomansky came over from Czechoslovakia, recently inducted into the Hall of Fame, and Frank Mahovlich and Paul Henderson joined the team, so that was interesting. He was also a heck of a player first year with the Ottawa Nationals, and then the injuries took their toll. He coached, ended up in the North American League, but quite a personality. I think we'll have on the show at a future date. And Ross Brooks, of course, is the epitome of perseverance in hockey. He didn't break in to the Boston Bruins until 1972-3 after Jerry Cheevers left the World Hockey Association. Ross Brooks came in, I believe he was 36 years old at that point, and went on to have a few very stellar seasons. So it was good to see them as well. And we're looking forward very much so. And I want to put my last point here. I'm going to do one bit of lobbying for a future inductee, and I'm going to lobby for Peter Taglianetti of formerly the Pittsburgh Penguins, and who played obviously for Lou in Providence, and was a guest on our show. And so I'm going to, just for the record, I'm going to lobby for him as well. So, but in the meantime, you've got a strong class this year, a strong event. Really looking forward to attending this year. Thanks so much for spending the time with us today. Now, ticket information and everything, well, obviously you just Google Rhode Island Hockey Hall of Fame, you'll get there. But in the show notes, the links will be there so our fans can link directly there. So, Vince, thanks again. We know that you're a Rhode Island hockey encyclopedia, and you did not disappoint. So we appreciate the background.
Thank you very much.
And we learned a lot about the influence that Rhode Island has had on the entire hockey world. Look forward to seeing you on September 6th, Vince. And until then, take care. Have a great event, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Same here. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks, Vince. Take care. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast, the voice of hockey legends. Just a reminder to please consider giving the show a rating and or review on Apple Podcasts. The link is in the show notes. These ratings and reviews help us become a lot more visible and make the show more accessible to hockey fans everywhere. I personally read all the reviews and greatly appreciate them all. If you have thoughts or suggestions for the show, you can contact us through our website at prohockeyalumni.org, or be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Pro Hockey Alumni. Thanks for listening.